Hey, welcome back guys. This is part 2 of today's video on Homebrew dungeon creation. And as I promised earlier, we're going to jump into the Old School Essentials monster book. And we're going to start fleshing out a dungeon from scratch. And when I talk about a dungeon, you could have it be a tower or a castle or a ruin above ground. It doesn't have to be an underground setting necessarily. In this case, I'm kind of thinking more in the directions of some kind of underground cave system near a water source, but we'll get into that in a little bit. But before you even start to draw out your dungeon, I think it's fun to go through your basic monster book and figure out what's going to be in it and how these things live together. You can do a really old school monster menagerie kind of a setup as well and figure out a backstory for that, and that can be fun too. But at this point in my DMing hobby, I like to build something that has just a little bit more cohesion. So we're just going to go ahead and flip open our monster book here, and it's all in here by alphabetical, and we're just going to look through and pick a monster. And I think I'm just going to land here on Bandit to start with. So since this is going to be more of a small to medium-sized dungeon, I think what we're going to look at over here, I like to break these down into 3 groups, and more on this bottom part here in a second. But you have your primary monsters, you have sort of secondary monsters possibly, and those could be slaves or allies or creatures that the other monsters that the primary monsters are trading with, or have some other kind of relationship with, where they'll cooperate. And then you'll have natural creatures that exist in the setting that you're writing up, and in this case it'd be a cave setting, right? Versus an outdoor setting, maybe a tower near a swamp might have different kinds of natural monsters that you could draw on. So our primary one, we're going to go for 10 different monsters as our upper limit. So here for our primary, we're just going to go ahead and put bandits. Okay. And right away here, we're just going to page through this book. You can see that bats is one of the things that's listed. And you have giant bats and vampire bats and normal bats. And so under natural, since it's a cave, I think it's a no-brainer that we're going to have normal bats and we're going to have some giant bats. In this case, I don't think I'm going to have vampire bats, because once you start having vampire stuff into something, it kind of creates its own undead-y kind of vibe. And I don't really want that for this dungeon location. The artwork, by the way, in this book is awesome. These books are made by Necrotic Gnome, and I love how they break them out by topic. So you can have a monster book, and you have a book that's all the spells, and you'll have a book that's all of the different character classes. And as a dungeon master, that's awesome, because I can just grab whatever book I need at the time and go to town. So if you're into the basic Dungeons and Dragons rules, I highly recommend Old School Essentials by Necrotic Gnome. And I am not paid or sponsored by them in any way. I'm just a huge fan of their work, and these books are awesome. So right away, one of the next things you come up is bears. So maybe I think it would be tough for bandits to live immediately next to a bear in a cave, but maybe the caves kind of meander underground for a ways, and there's an area of the caves that are occupied and used actively by the bandits, but maybe there are other sections of the cave which are avoided by them, and maybe one of the reasons they avoid them is because there are bears, or is a big bear living in there. So I think maybe as a minor boss somewhere in the cave is a big cave bear, and a few bandits have wandered down in there over the years for different reasons, and so the cave bear has managed to kill a bunch of bandits. Maybe the previous bandit leader was trying to hide the bandit's treasure from the rest of his followers. Maybe he has, the original bandit lord had 30 followers, let's say, and he was sort of like a pirate captain in that he didn't want to share all of his treasure with his cronies, and so he went deeper into. So now you have the cave bear is a kind of a sub boss, and he's got his whatever treasure fell from the previous bandit lord. So we're gonna do cave bear, and we're gonna just make a note: minor boss, previous bandit lord treasure. And as a DM, your brain is working. Is you go in here and maybe there's some fire beetles in this area. They're handy creatures. If you harvest the eyes out of them, you get a cool light source, and they're not particularly dangerous. Other than the cave bear, all these different creatures kind of fall in the same difficulty range as far as hit dice and threat level and stuff as bandits. I don't really want to have berserkers in there necessarily. I think a black pudding is way too tough for this particular location. But maybe as part of the bandits, under here I'm going to do a hierarchy. So you've got NPCs, which are sort of like your main boss. These are the leaders of your primary monsters, whether they're bandits or goblins or orcs or whatever your primary monsters are. So you have like some named NPCs, which are your leaders. And underneath that, maybe you have some brigands, which are your tougher bandits, which go out into the wilderness more often to kind of scout. Maybe you have a dozen of those guys. And then under here, the bandit camp has grown since the previous leader died. Has continued to grow, and so maybe there's 40 regular bandits in that group as well. So right now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Looking for maybe 4 more creatures. So you just kind of keep going through here. Carcass crawlers, like the old carrion crawler. I think that those are super, super deadly. They're kind of a go-to in a lot of dungeons and caves and stuff, but they're just a little bit too dangerous from what I'm looking for right now. Giant centipedes are pretty cool. In this particular edition, their poison just makes you sick. They don't just kill you outright, so I think that falls into what we're looking for. So now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We've got 7 creatures. Let's see. And keep in mind, you can always make your own creatures, which I like to do. And I keep a notebook just of my notes on my own made-up creatures. And some of my own made-up creatures are existing monsters that I've taken and I've tweaked in some way so that they're far enough removed from the original that they're, instead of being a boar, or maybe they're a tundra boar or a bog boar or something like that. In some way they're different. Maybe they've got 1 additional power or something. Just enough to set them apart from the main one. And some of my monster creations are, completely different from anything in any monster book that I know of. Although, again, you can pull from all kinds of different monster books for ideas and just sort of tweak them for whatever rule set you're using. So let's see here. Driver ants now. Elephants. So there's no super mega way of doing this. That's like better than anything else. I think, let's see, up ahead, I'm having an idea. Okay, so Gray Ooze. Gray Ooze is kind of a cool dungeon monster. I like those. So maybe somewhere down here there's 1 or 2 gray oozes, and now we're up to 8 monsters. And so that leaves us with our secondary monster. So I start to think, who is enslaved and works for these creatures, or who do they, the bandits, or who do they trade with? And you know what? I think I'm just going to go with goblins. I think the goblins are looking for slaves to work at a different location. And maybe there is a goblin map that shows the location for where the slaves are being taken. So then maybe as a sub area you have slaves, which are mostly humans, but maybe some other non-humans that are kept in some pens, that kind of thing, slave pens. And that's not like a major part of this whole thing, but it's kind of a way to connect these two groups. So maybe the goblins have a hobgoblin boss, and he has 4 hobgoblin bodyguards. And then this detachment of goblins, maybe there's another 20 of them. And typically maybe 10 plus 2 hobs will leave occasionally with slaves to take them to wherever the goblins are using them. And maybe that's not even like a major goblin warren or lair. Maybe it's just a small mining operation that the goblins have locally. So we haven't even really gone through this whole book, and there's all kinds of other resources that you can draw on. One of the ones that I use frequently because I'm using the BX rules is this creature catalog that was put out years ago by TSR, and there are 2 versions of this. I own both of them. The earlier version is broken down more by creature archetype, and this one's more alphabetical. And I have to be honest that this one is the one that I prefer to use, simply because having an alphabetical reference is easier for me. But this book is just loaded with all kinds of monsters that are already written up for the basic Dungeons and Dragons rules, and so these work really well with the version of D&D that I'm playing, BX or Old School Essentials, but it also worked for any version, I think, of basic D&D that you decided to go for. So we only have a few more minutes left, so now that you've got your kind of all of your monsters figured out, maybe you want to do a little side view of your dungeon to start planning. So maybe you have above ground, you have a lake, and there's a cavern over here. Maybe there's some trees that are concealing this area, and under the trees maybe there's some tents where some of the bandits are at, and maybe there's some of their horses there, and then there's this cave entrance. Okay, and maybe there's a waterfall that flows down into this area, so that this area is almost like its own little mini valley. It's hard to see from overland because it's surrounded by trees and forest, and so somebody coming from the side wouldn't really spy this place out right away. But there's a creek or a pretty good water source here that's constantly dumping water in here, which is going into this kind of lake where they have their camp and the cave. And maybe the water then flows into this cave and follows the caverns that are starting down here, and then maybe it plummets down into this other area down here where you have another underground lake, and then that continues down underneath. And so you've got your different cavern levels kind of coming off here, and you're just kind of thinking to yourself about how all this would interplay. And maybe you've got some sub-levels and areas off of here. Maybe there's another area that comes up over this way that has another entrance towards the surface, and sort of down in here is the bear comes in through here, and over in here is where the cave bear has his place. At any rate, we are out of time. I hope that is helpful. Have a good day.